When Oslo van der Wallace's The Good Line number 278 was presented at the Guggenheim Museum in Sweden last month, there was little background presented about this great work. The family members who had opened his studio a month after his last reported phone conversation simply assumed that this work, the last in the numbered series, must have been as close to his desired vision as possible. However, after the local investigation bureau turned over his journals and notebooks to the family, a deeper understanding of the work was established. Inspiration began while van der Wallace was viewing a midnight screening of Wim Wenders's Wings of Desire. Peter Falk, playing Peter Falk, delivers a throwaway line while sketching a portrait of an extra on the film he is acting in. "That's a good line," he says to himself. This started van der Wallace thinking about what constituted a good line, and so his quest began. But more interesting than the final product and the reactions and ramifications it has stirred are the motivations behind the rejection of the 277 other attempts. Taking cues from the film, he started using a standard number 2 pencil on sketch paper. However, after 20 attempts, this technique was rejected, simply citing the impermanence and weakness of graphite in his journal. For line number 21, van der Wallace returns to the medium he knows best, and begins to work with paints. He started simply with a standard 20 by 30 inch canvas, using a basic round brush and solid black acrylic paint, Van Gogh Catalog number 45, Mars Black. Van der Wallace's diary notes that he rejected the early attempts based solely on instinct. The process was to simply approach the canvas and try to draw the best line he could, then to reflect on the piece and try to determine if and how it could be improved. After completing work number 43, van der Wallace notes that he can see the weakness of his own technique in the line. Examination reveals hesitations and uncertainty. He decides that his painterly technique is not adequate to create the line for which he is striving. At this point, van der Wallace begins to study Japanese calligraphy. The study becomes fairly intense. As those who knew van der Wallace could attest, this is typical of the artist. His obsessive focus is well known in his circle of friends. While he does produce a lot of calligraphy, he abstains from working on the line project during this time period due to his own impurity. After a massively productive period resulting in 43 paintings in less than 2 weeks, van der Wallace discovers that paint is inadequate for this work. Upon close scrutiny, he realizes that paint does not produce a single line, but rather a collection of overlapping and interwoven lines. In disgust, van der Wallace throws all his paints and brushes into the furnace. After much scrutiny, van der Wallace concluded that ink was the best medium for the project due to its permanence, solidity, and depth of hue. After 3 months and 27 new attempts, van der Wallace notes in his journal that he felt that the problem was not only a weakness in his technique, but indicative of a general weakness in his own body. His balance is off and prevents him from being capable of moving in the perfect way necessary to draw such a line. So, van der Wallace begins to study both yoga and Zen. By the time he had completed line 164, the curves of the line began to resemble the curves of a woman the artist had loved, but she had left him. As perfect as the artist may have considered her, the fact that she left indicates that there was no perfection there. After drawing number 184, van der Wallace began to think that the problem was with a weakness in his own body. He began to trace various parts of his body in an attempt to find the flaws. These sketches fill over 30 pages in his journal, but it appears that none of them became any part of the actual numbered series. It is mentioned now only to explain the following shift in his work. Starting with drawing number 185, van der Wallace began to try to find lines in other great works of art. Line number 185 begins with the first tracing of the notes from Beethoven's Ninth Symphony. That resulted in 13 rejected works. For line number 199, he began tracing parts of Leonardo da Vinci's Mona Lisa. This resulted in 24 rejected works. This strategy continues for 67 more drawings, taking inspiration from sources as wide-ranging as Michelangelo's David, the Taj Mahal, and the Pacific Coast Highway. According to the notebooks, line number 214 was deemed obscene. Van der Wallace notes that line number 232 was childish and immature. Line 255 was considered to be van der Wallace's greatest failure. As such, he has destroyed the original drawing and it is missing from the set. In his journal, van der Waals rejects line 262 as being too historical. Drawing number 256 notes a new revelation for van der Waals. He deduces that the problem with all his lines is that they are not based on the present, but on his past. Each line he has drawn thus far is based on the influence of his experiences. So in order to attempt to bring the drawings into the present, he decides that he must actually live each line. He begins to take walks and use these travels as sources for his lines, mapping his journey onto each blank page. Drawing number 262 is taken from his trip around North Aberlane. Drawing number 265 resulted from the artist wandering for a day in a cornfield outside of Kankakee. However, each of these is still rejected. After finishing drawing number 277, van der Waals writes in his journal, "In a moment of absolute depression, I looked back at all the works, at all the failures I had made, and I realized the problem was not with the lines themselves, but with my method of looking at them. Each line I drew was only a segment, a small portion of a greater whole. The problem with my work was that it was being viewed in pieces. Unable to see the whole of the project, I was unable to recognize the continuation of the action. The problem was that each of my lines was trapped in a finite space and time by the paper and ink I was using to capture it. Perfection cannot be limited in such a way. It extends beyond that. In order to create something truly perfect, I too must be able to extend myself. I have an idea." This is the last note in his journals.